Welcome back to my swamp. Today's video is an implant 101, everything that you need to know about implants. Disclaimer, as always, I am not a vet, I am not a professional. This is just what I have learned over the years keeping ferrets and having ferrets that are implanted. I've learned this from having discussions with my vet and doing my own research into the product, into the manufacturer, reading studies that involve this implant. This is all just my own knowledge that I want to compile together. That's easy for people to access because this is really important. Ferret reproductive needs are very specific to ferrets and you have to have a lot of knowledge beforehand in order to know what you have to do with your ferret. This isn't so much a concern if you're in like North America or in countries where ferrets have to come desexed legally, because desexed ferrets don't need an implant unless they develop adrenal disease. But if you live in a country where you have access to intact ferrets, maybe you have breeders, or maybe it's just not common to desex ferrets where you live, and you're looking into the implant, this is the video for you. For example, where I live in Scotland, the UK, we get fully intact ferrets. It's actually really quite uncommon to find ferrets that have been desexed. However, implants are very common as a contraceptive method for both gills and hobs, so we have learned quite a lot over the years, but not enough. There's still a lot that we don't know about the implant. So what is the implant? The implant is called the Super-Lordan implant, and it is a small hormone-emitting implant that is injected subcutaneously into your ferret's, under your ferret's skin. So if this is your ferret's skin, the implant just goes whoop, just kind of under there, and it slowly emits hormones which will essentially chemically castrate your ferret. Your ferret won't come into season, your ferret won't be able to reproduce, and in a lot of cases that's what we want. Super-Lordan is the brand name made by the manufacturer Virbac. The actual hormone or chemical, I suppose, itself that is used is called deslorelin acetate, and so you'll often hear people refer to the implant as the Des implant or the Super-Lordan implant. Both are correct, it's the same thing, just different names. The Super-Lordan implant comes in two sizes. It comes in the 4.7mg dosage. The larger size is 9.4mg, and it is not licensed for use in ferrets, but some vets will be willing to use them in ferrets. The actual size difference between the two concentrations of implant, the 4.7 versus the 9.4, the actual size of the implant itself is pretty much the same. There's not really a big massive difference in the size of the implant. What is different is the concentration of deslorelin acetate that is in the implant. So because the 9.4mg implant has more concentration of deslorelin acetate, it's going to last a little bit longer than the 4.7mg version. The manufacturer recommends the 4.7mg, the smaller size, to be replaced every year, but it depends on the ferret. For some ferrets it's reported to only last 6 months, for some ferrets it's reported to last 2 years or sometimes even longer. However, keep in mind that the 4.7mg is the only one that is licensed for use in ferrets, and specifically hobs and gibbs. It is not licensed for use in gills and sprites, but it can be used in gills and sprites. The 9.4mg implant, which again, like I said, it isn't massively bigger than the smaller one, it's just a stronger concentration. That has been reported to last longer, so at minimum typically it will last about 2 years, and at longest typically it will last around 4 years, but there has been cases where it's been reported that it's only lasted a year. In some cases it's been reported to last 7 years. Some people claim it's lasted their ferret's lifetime. It really just depends on the ferret. The reason, reportedly, I don't know if this is fact, but this is just what I have learned from my vets and from speaking to other people. Reportedly the 9.4mg version isn't licensed for use in ferrets because they don't know how long it lasts. There's too much of a variable for how long the larger implant size works in ferrets, so the manufacturers therefore can't give any information on how regularly to get it changed, so it's therefore going to be harder to sell it in use for ferrets, but it can still be used for ferrets. Both of my ferrets that are implanted, Akira is implanted and Seath is implanted, both of them have the 9.4mg dosage, and so far the implant is still working. They were inserted the end of 2018 going into 2019, and we're now midway through 2020 and they're still working perfectly fine. Obviously that's kind of typical for the larger size because it is reported to last at least 2 years, so we're kind of getting to the minimum time frame that it lasts. But yeah, theirs are still working perfectly fine, but again it does vary and depend on the individual ferret. So what is the implant used for exactly? The implant in the UK and in other countries where we have access to intact ferrets, it is mostly used as a form of chemical castration. Now the reason for this is because vets in these kind of countries typically are uncomfortable spaying and neutering ferrets because of the link to adrenal disease. So oftentimes vets would much rather have your ferret implanted than spayed or neutered. And in the past few years the implant has kind of exploded in use, everybody's using it and it's really common, and it is now one of the most recommended methods for having your ferrets chemically castrated rather than having them spayed and neutered if you have a mixed sex group, or if you don't want to deal with your gills and your hobs coming into season in spring, this is the method for you. The implant is also used to treat hormonal aggression and can also be used for gills that are quite prone to coming into phantom pregnancies. Having phantom pregnancies can increase a gill's chance of developing womb infections like pyometra, which can be fatal if left untreated. So the implant is commonly used in these scenarios to treat that specific issue, whether it be hormonal aggression or regular phantom pregnancies. However, in the US, the implant isn't used for its chemical castration benefits. It is used to help treat the clinical signs of adrenal disease. Adrenal disease in the US is incredibly common. I want to do an entire video on it because it's fascinating to me. Roughly 1 in 4 ferrets in the US seem to develop adrenal disease once they reach the age of 3. And it's believed that this is because ferrets in the US are desexed at a really young age, typically 5 to 8 weeks, which is absolutely horrendous. So in the US they have this big problem where all these ferrets are developing adrenal disease, and there is no cure for adrenal disease, but what we have learned is that the deslorelin acetate implant can help treat the clinical signs of adrenal disease. And just like it can help treat the clinical signs of adrenal disease, it can also be used to help prevent adrenal disease. However, I don't recommend going and having your ferret implanted preventatively just because you feel like it. Talk about it with your vet, do some more research on your own. Of course I have teeth implanted preventatively, but that's only because that's what my vet really strongly recommended and I don't want to go against my vet's wishes. The supralorelin implant is also really commonly used in the UK to help reduce smell, because that is one really great benefit of using it. Intact ferrets have this really strong musky smell about them pretty much year round. This isn't something you're going to experience in the US where you have desexed ferrets, but here in the UK and in Europe, ferrets have this strong pungent musky smell about them, and having them implanted will not only chemically castrate them but will help reduce that smell. Typically you'll notice a reduction in odour between 5 and 14 weeks. Again, it depends on the ferret, it depends on the size of the implant that you went for, and it depends on how smelly your ferret is and what you feed them, and a bunch of other things come into consideration, but typically it's 5 to 14 weeks you're going to notice a reduction in smell. This is the most commonly used desexing method in Britain and Europe and other countries where you can have access to intact ferrets. So how is the implant inserted and how exactly does it work? It's kind of one of those things where people hear, oh, you can give your ferret an implant, that's a bit weird, how does that work? And let me tell you, it works. So the implant is typically inserted into your ferret under sedation, and the reason for this is that ferrets are really wriggly creatures, especially if they're uncomfortable going to the vet, and if you were to inject the implant while the ferret's wriggling, there's more of a chance for the needle and the implant to get dirty. And then it gets inserted into your ferret's skin and it's no longer sterile, and it's believed that this could cause the implant to not work fully effectively or to work for a much shorter period of time. So for example, if you get the 9.4mg one and you expect it to work for 2 years, but your vet does it without sedating your ferret and the needle and the implant gets dirty, it might then only work for 6 months in theory. However, you should never have the 9.4mg implant inserted into your ferret without sedation, because the needle is quite a bit bigger and it's really going to be uncomfortable for your ferret if they're awake. Some vets will insert the smaller implant without sedating your ferret, however most vets aren't going to recommend this, again because it creates an unsterile environment, it's a little bit more risky, a little bit more dangerous, and it's just much easier for the vet and for the ferret and for everybody involved to just have the ferret sedated. Now the sedation used for the implant isn't the same as having your ferret sedated for surgery. There's a big difference. The anaesthesia that they use for sedating for implants versus surgery is the exact same type of sedation. The difference is that for surgeries the ferrets have to be sedated for a much longer period of time, whereas for the implant it's a 2-minute procedure. The ferrets don't have to be under sedation for very long, so the vets can use a smaller concentration. The ferret can be woken up much quicker, and therefore there are much less risks associated with having your ferret sedated and implanted versus having your ferret sedated and spayed, because a spay is a much longer procedure, it takes a lot more time, it's a lot more invasive, and a lot more anaesthesia has to be used. So the implant itself, it's typically like around the size, or if not smaller than, a microchip. It's very, very, very small, and what it does is it slowly releases hormones into your ferret's body, and this not only works to help chemically castrate them, but it can bring them out of season. The implant will completely stop your ferret from cycling, and by this I mean your ferret cycling in and out of season. So typically March comes around, your gills will come into season, they'll have a cycle, and then they'll come out of season by a gill jab or by being mated, and then they'll have a couple of months calm, and then maybe August or September hits and they have another season, they've cycled again into season, and they're going to have to be brought out of season again. So most gills will only have one cycle a year, but some ferrets will have a couple cycles each year, or sometimes they'll have a couple cycles every few years. It just depends on the ferret. So if you get your ferret implanted, you don't have to worry about gill jabs, you just have to worry about having the implant kept up to date. If you know what the human contraceptive implant is, the ferret contraceptive implant works pretty much exactly the same way. You just stick it under the skin, it does its thing, and then you get it changed or updated once it runs out. An interesting thing to note, when it comes to using the implant to treat the clinical signs of adrenal disease, there have been few studies that have suggested or proven that in some cases the Superlorn implant will actually shrink the tumours that grow within the adrenal gland, and in some cases it will even shrink the adrenal gland itself. And in these cases the ferrets completely stop exhibiting clinical signs of having adrenal disease, and in some cases the implant would then be considered a cure. It is not a confirmed cure, it's not going to cure every single ferret, it's just something that can happen sometimes, seemingly. And again, this comes back around to us just not knowing enough about the implant and how it works exactly. We've not really been using it for long enough, and not enough studies have been done showing its effects, because it's only licensed for use in Hobbs and Gibbs. So the implant takes 4 to 12 weeks to start being fully effective. So if you have a Hob and a Gill and you get them implanted and they're sexually mature, keep them separate for 12 weeks until you know that the implant is fully working and those ferrets are now unable to reproduce. In some cases it has been reported with the smaller implant that after 18 months of use a Gill will get pregnant. So that's something to keep in mind. You really want to keep an eye on your implant and making sure that it's not going to run out and you're going to end up having an accidental pregnancy. That would be an absolute disaster. And this is an official disclaimer made by the manufacturer and made by vets, is that if you have a mixed sex group and you get them implanted after 18 months, you might end up with an accidental mating. Talking about having to keep your implant up to date and knowing that your ferrets are completely covered and safe from accidental pregnancies, how will you know that your ferret's implant needs changed? The best thing to do is know what size of implant your ferret has first of all, and find out how long that typically will last. Then you want to set a reminder with your vet or by yourself, or just keep it up here, that the ferret is that the implant is going to run out in X amount of years. And as you approach that, maybe 6 months prior, so say you have the 4.7 milligram implant, it typically lasts 2 years. Once you reach that 18-month mark, you're going to want to start looking for signs that the implant is wearing off. If you have a mixed sex group, you might want to start doing this a little bit earlier, and you might want to talk to your vet about it as well. So the clinical signs that the implant is starting to wear off. Number 1, your Gill's vulva may become enlarged like she's in season. Number 2 is your Hobbs testicles may become more enlarged, and the implant will actually sometimes cause the testicles to recede a little bit and shrink a little bit. I don't know if those are like the correct terms to use. So when the implant starts to wear off, the testicles will become more enlarged and more pronounced again. Number 3 is a change in sexual behaviour, and by this I mean the behaviours that ferrets will exhibit when they are ready for sexual reproduction. That is things like building nests, being more territorial, being a little bit more nippy, grabbing other ferrets by the scruff, nipping their necks, trying to mount them. They might be scuffling, they might start falling out, and you might notice a drastic change in smell in your ferrets. When my gels come into season, the change in smell is astronomical. They smell so bad when they're in season. So it's fairly easy to notice when the implant is starting to wear off, but you do have to keep an eye out for these things. If you're somebody that has ferrets outdoors and you maybe only see them for 2 hours a day, maybe they're working ferrets, as you notice that as you come to the date that the implant is due to wear off 6 months before, you're going to want to start spending a little bit more time with your ferrets just to make sure that you're not seeing any of these signs happening. If you're ever in doubt, you must take your ferret to the vet and talk to your vet about it. Your vet will further be able to examine your ferret to see if there's any other signs of them coming into season that maybe we won't notice. So if in doubt, always go to your vet. Don't go to YouTube. Don't think, oh, my ferret's evolved swollen, I'm going to hop on YouTube. Go to the vet, because it might not be the implant wearing off, it might be something else. So how do you change the implant? If you're a human and you have the implant, you'll know that every couple of years you have to go and have your implant removed from your arm and a new one put in. The process is not the same for ferrets. Ferrets do not get the implants changed. What happens is the implant runs out, you take your ferret to the vet, and a new implant gets put in. There are a few reasons for this, and I'm going to try my best to sum it up and make it make sense, because it might sound a little bit crazy when you're just leaving implants floating around in your ferret's body. Yes, that's exactly what you're doing, but there's a few very good reasons for it. The first reason is ferrets are really long animals. They lose and gain weight with the seasons, and so implants quite often just go missing in their bodies. They'll just take a wee walk, they'll just relocate to somewhere else. You know, the implants, they're under the skin at the back of the neck, and it decides, I'm going to pack a bag and take a little holiday down to the bottom of the spine. And so if the vet was to go and try to remove that implant, they're going to be searching around in your ferret's entire body trying to find it, and it's a very small little tiny thing, and that's pretty much impossible, right? We can't expect that from vets. They would have to do a bunch of scans, bunch of ultrasounds, and then it would be a really invasive surgery potentially, and it's just not worth the risk. Now, I hear a lot, I read a lot on the internet that people say, oh, the implant doesn't need to be changed because it dissolves. And this is something that I've read a lot, I've heard a lot, and I kind of understand where it comes from, but it's not true. It is completely untrue. The implant isn't going to just dissolve in your ferret's system the way that dissolvable stitches would. So if you take your ferret to get spayed or neutered and they have stitches, oftentimes those are dissolvable stitches, so they don't have to be removed. And the implant doesn't work like this, it doesn't dissolve. What actually happens is, as the implant gets older and it's wearing off and the hormones inside are losing their potency, the implant becomes prone to breaking, and little pieces will come off and the implant will break, and it travels around. It doesn't dissolve, but it does break into tiny little pieces, and again, this is why it's hard to remove. If your ferret's implant breaks into 4 little pieces, how the hell is your vet going to be able to find that? That would be an absolute disaster. So no, it doesn't dissolve, but it does fall apart. And is this dangerous? Well, let's talk about that. There have been some instances recorded where at the site of the implantation, or at the site where the implant is sitting, tumours have grown, or sometimes as abscesses. Does this happen 100% of the time? No. Is it common? No. Is it possible? Yes. Should you take it into consideration when deciding whether or not to get your ferret implanted? Absolutely. Do I think it should stop you from getting your ferret implanted? No, especially in cases where it is the absolute best option. Nothing that we do to our ferrets is 100% safe. Everything comes with its risks. Even using 100% fleece hammocks isn't going to be completely safe, because people say, oh, you know, those hammocks don't fray, it's the only safe material. Yeah, sure, the material doesn't fray, but they can chew holes in them within 5 minutes, get their head stuck and choke and die. And it's the same with anything that we do with our ferrets. There's always going to be a risk associated, and what you have to do as a responsible ferret owner is weigh up the pros and cons of the situation, see what other alternatives you have access to, and talk to your vet and make an informed decision. So instead of the implant being removed and a new one put in, you just take your ferret to the vet when the implant is no longer effective and you have a new one put in. Over time, this could mean that your ferret has 4 or 5 implants floating around in its body, and I'm afraid there's absolutely nothing you can do about that. Maybe you could find a really experienced, specialised ferret vet that would be willing to do a surgery to remove them, but in my opinion that would probably never be an option. So when should the implant not be used? There are very few scenarios in which a vet would advise against the use of the implant because it's so effective, it has so many positive benefits, it's used in other animals, it's even used in rats. People use the deslorelin acetate implant in pet rats, and it has great effects in rats as well. So you're very rarely going to be in a situation where a vet tells you you can't use the implant. But there are a few scenarios where you're going to want to avoid using the implant, and that is pregnant gills and lactating gills. And the reason for this is that we just don't know what would happen. It has never been studied, it has never been researched, it's not even licensed for gills in the first place. Therefore, we have absolutely no idea what a pregnant or lactating gel would experience if she was implanted, and we don't know the effect that it would have on the kids. So if you're a breeder, I don't know why you're watching my videos, you probably are a little bit more intelligent and smarter than me, but if you're a breeder or somebody who's looking into breeding, don't have your ferrets implanted if you intend to breed them, or if they're pregnant, or if they're lactating. The other thing I want to mention here is that if you have a hob and you want to breed them in a few years, but you want to have them implanted before then, for whatever reason, it's personally you, the implant has been known to cause infertility even after only a couple of years of use. So if you have a hob that you want to breed, or your breeder wants to borrow him back to breed them in a few years, don't have him implanted because you're running the risk of making him infertile. This one's a big one, and it's one that I want to talk about quite in depth because it's super important. Never implant a gel who has been in season for longer than 3 weeks. And this is not something that a lot of people know. It's kind of hard to find this information, but it's pertinent that you know this. If you have a gel who's been in season for 3 weeks, your only option is to mate her with a vasectomied hob, or have her gel jabbed. The implant in Spain is potentially lethal. The reason for this is, if you refer back to my gel jab video, you'll know that when a gel is in season, she's producing estrogen. There's an estrogen spike in her body, that's what brings her into season, and that's what makes her susceptible to mating, right? And what can happen with this is estrogen blocks the production of red blood cells, which after a prolonged period of time can lead to anemia and bone marrow suppression, and that's why it's important to bring your gels out of season. The problem that the implant creates is that for the first 2 weeks that your gel has that implant in her system, she may have an estrogen spike. Her body may start producing more estrogen. Now, the reason that this estrogen spike is a problem specifically in gels that have been in season for 3 weeks or longer is that bone marrow suppression typically will start to take place at 4 weeks of a gel being in season, and that is when anemia will start. If you implant a gel that has been in season for 3 weeks and she then experiences a 2-week estrogen spike, that is going to further block the red blood cell production, and it's going to make the bone marrow suppression much worse, which could lead to anemia. So if your gel has been in season for 3 weeks or longer and you don't want babies and you don't have access to a vasectomied hob, get her gel jabbed. I personally would play it safe and not have a gel implanted if she's been in season for 2 weeks or longer, but that's just my personal preference. I'm a little bit of a paranoid freak and I really worry myself about these things, but it's something that you can talk about with your vet. It's just something to keep in mind. Okay, so side effects of the implant. This is a really commonly asked question. What are the negative side effects that the implant can cause? And I don't want to say none, but it's virtually none. Other than causing infertility in hobs and potentially leading to bone marrow suppression and anemia in gels that have been in season for 3 weeks or longer, there are very little negative side effects, and that's why it's so popular. One side effect I want to mention is a false season, and this is when that estrogen spike in the gel system will cause the gel to think that she's in season when she's not. So you might see that vulva enlargement, you might see that sexual behaviour, you might notice that she's a little bit smellier, but typically after 2 weeks, once her body has adjusted to the amount of hormones being produced, she will stop all of that and that will all go away. It's just a false season, it's not a real season. Just wait a couple of weeks, wait for the side effects to subside, and if you're noticing no change, go back to your vet. Sometimes in some ferrets the injection site can become a little bit sore and a little bit swollen. This happened to Akira. She's a very small, little, slender, tiny little ferret, and she got the 9.4mg one, which is the bigger size. And on her neck where it got inserted, she was a little bit swollen and a little bit red for a couple of days. But I think after like 4 days it subsided, she wasn't bothering bothering it. None of the ferrets were really agitating it, so it went away. Typically it will take up to a week for the swelling and the irritation to subside, but if it takes longer than that, go back to your vet. Now the biggest side effect, the most dangerous side effect, is also the rarest side effect, and that is an allergic reaction. Some ferrets just are allergic to deslorelin acetate, which is the compound used in the implant, and it's potentially lethal. These ferrets, usually within 24 to 48 hours, will start to show signs of lethargy. They'll stop eating, they might have trouble drinking, and they'll be less active. They might have episodes of vomiting and diarrhea, they might start to go pale, and in that case it's an emergency. Go to the emergency vet immediately. A few other side effects that people sometimes notice is a little bit of hair loss. This can sometimes happen for just a couple of weeks while the ferret's body is adjusting to the implant. Again, this is something that happened to Akira. She lost a little bit of fur for I think 2 or 3 weeks, and then after that her fur all grew back and she's been a furry little noodle ever since. So that's something else to keep in mind. It's not a big deal, but if you see it, you don't have to panic. Okay, so before I wrap this video up, I asked in the Patsu and Friends Discord server if any of you had questions regarding the implant that I could address. And this is just to make sure that I've covered all ground and made sure that the questions that people are often going to have actually been answered in this video, because again, I'm not a professional, I'm not an expert, it's hard for me to actually make sure I'm getting all the information into the video that I need. So a lot of you asked me questions and I really appreciate it, it helps me a lot, so I'm going to go through and answer those questions for you. Okay, first question is, have I ever had a ferret implant come out or move? I haven't had an implant come out, but I have no idea where Seath and Akira's implants are. I used to be able to feel them and I now can't. I can still feel Dusk's microchip in her neck. I can't feel Akira's microchip and I can't feel either of their implants. Do they become sensitive areas for the ferret once the implant stops working? This has been reported in some cases. It doesn't seem to be common, or at least it's not talked about or written about a lot, but I could definitely see that becoming a potential issue, especially if it's quite close to the surface of the skin. With Seath and Akira, their implants have travelled so far that I don't think it will become a sensitive area, but that is something to keep in mind and something that you might want to look out for. What to expect during that estrogen spike that happens in gills for the first 2 weeks. Expect nipping, hissing, a lot of ducking, potentially nest building, scruffing, biting the nape of the neck, generally scuffling, being a little bit more territorial, being a little bit more protective. These are all really normal. You can also expect an increase in smell, you can also expect the vulva to become more swollen, but again, this all subsides after 2 weeks, don't worry about it. Is there a way to know that an implant has failed? You will know the implant has failed if your ferret starts showing those sexual behaviours again. The number one thing you want to look for is the vulva becoming swollen, or the testicles becoming enlarged, or an increase in smell. Those are usually the quickest signs that you will notice. Particularly with Hobbs, the testicles become so obvious, they're so hard to miss. The vulva becoming swollen is so hard to miss, but not all gills will get a swollen vulva. Some gills will just have an increase in smell. If you suspect that your implant has failed, take your ferret to the vet. Do you get a new implant before the current one stops working or after? This is a really, really, really good question. Oh, I really wish I'd thought of this myself. Okay, so it depends on the vet, okay? Different vets are going to tell you different things, different breeders and different rescues are going to tell you different things. So really what I would advise is, say you've had the implant in for 18 months and you're expecting it to last 24 months, at the 18-month mark, go back to your vet and ask them what they would recommend doing. What my vet has recommended that I do is that as soon as I notice the first signs of the implant wearing off, I go and have them implanted again. And because the hormones are already in the ferret system, it doesn't take the full 12 weeks for the new implant to start working again. And this is the exact same with the human contraceptive implant, right? If you go and get it changed in a couple of years, you're not going to have to wait that full 12 weeks for it to start working again. It just starts working immediately because there's already that the hormones are already in the ferret system. But again, that's something you want to discuss with your vet. Every ferret is different, every vet recommends something different. Can an implant fail after just being put in straight away? I haven't found any information about this, I haven't found any cases of it, I haven't found anybody talking about it. The only thing that I've ever noticed people talking about or things that vets point out is that allergic reaction that can happen. The implant has amazing success rates. It is it's really a great option if you don't want to have your ferrets spayed and neutered. And yeah, it doesn't seem to have that many issues associated with it, to be honest, but again, this comes down to us not knowing a whole lot about it because not a lot of studies have been done. How much did I pay for my ferrets to be implanted? So Seath cost a little bit more than Akira did, and I think this is because he's a bigger ferret, so he required a little bit more anaesthesia. The implant was the exact same size for both ferrets. Seath was around £120 and Akira was around 100, and this was for, you know, the pre-consultation, having the implant put in, and the implant itself. So, but it really depends on area and it depends on the vet, right? So for me, for Akira, it was 100 for the 9.4mg size, but for somebody down in London, for the 9.4mg size, for a ferret the size of Akira, could cost 250. Just look around, contact different vets, try and find the best deal while not compromising how good the vet is. The longest an implant has lasted and the shortest an implant has lasted. Okay, the shortest I have heard the implant lasting is 6 months, and that's for the 4.7mg size. For the 9.4mg size, the shortest I've heard it lasting is 2 years. For the smaller size again, the 4.7mg, the longest I've heard it lasting is 4 years, which is pretty impressive. And for the 9.4mg size, the longest I've heard it lasting is pretty much a ferret's entire lifetime, like 8 years, if not a little bit longer. This, I think, is really quite uncommon. Every single example that I've just given, I think, is quite uncommon. Don't expect that from your implant. Expect it to wear off after 2 years or 4 years. Would there be any difference in behaviour after getting a ferret implanted? Sometimes. If you've implanted for hormonal aggression, you might notice a lot less aggression. You might notice the ferret becoming lazier. You might notice the ferret being a lot more gentle and just kind of like, you know, like waddling around the place instead of being crazy hyper all the time. That's what happened with Seath. We had him implanted and neutered for hormonal aggression, and it just took all that crazy energy out of him. He still nips, he's still a little bit bitey. That's just his personality, but there's definitely been a positive impact that neutering and implanting has had on Seath. Some ferrets after being implanted will become a lot more cuddly, lazy, less active. Some implanted ferrets might start eating more, some might start eating less. It just depends on the individual ferret. Something to note that I want to just quickly add into this, it wasn't part of the question, but something that I've noticed is that my implanted ferrets are so much softer than my intact ferrets. Like so much softer, and they don't smell, which is absolutely wonderful. I can like huff Seath, and as long as he hasn't rolled in poop, which he does quite often, he smells like absolutely nothing. But if I like really get dusk up to my nose and like really huff her, she smells like pee. What is the best age for Hobbs to be implanted? Fantastic question. The age that is generally recommended to have a ferret implanted is the winter before their first season. And when I say winter, I don't mean December, I mean like kind of like October, November time, autumn going into winter. Okay, so ferrets become sexually mature at around 8 months of age, so you want to have the implant put in kind of like right as they become sexually mature, right before they become sexually mature, so that the 12 weeks passes before the ferrets actually start cycling and coming into season. So typically you're going to want to have your ferrets implanted in October, November time before they become sexually mature, and this goes for Gills and it goes for Hobbs. Alternatively, with Gills, you can wait for them to come into season and then immediately get them implanted. Don't wait 3 weeks, get them implanted immediately, and that might give you a little bit more coverage. You might cover a few more seasons doing it that way. But the reason it's typically recommended to do it in October, November is because that extends the implant's use, right? You're going to cover more seasons that way. You're going to prevent them from coming into the first season. You're going to prevent that potential second season in summer, and you could potentially prevent them from coming into season the following year. In theory, again, it's different for every ferret, but that's why it's recommended that you do it that way, and that's what most vets recommend, that's what most breeders require, and that's what most rescues require. In terms of the implant, I would love to know if it reduces the smell in the same way as neutering. I believe it does. Obviously Seath is neutered as well as being implanted, but Akira is only implanted and they smell the exact same. So I would say that it works just as well as neutering does. Does it impact their growing size? This is theorised, but again it's not proven, it hasn't been concluded in any studies. but it's something you might want to look into. There is a suggestion that having your ferrets implanted before they reach sexual maturity, or just as they reach sexual maturity, or before 2 years in general, there is a theory that you could slightly hinder their growth. Is this a bad thing? Not necessarily. If you want to avoid it, then avoid it. But it's not really going to have a big massive impact. Seath was implanted when he was around a year old, and he is still absolutely massive. And the hobs that I have, the kits, will be implanted in November. It affecting their growth isn't stopping me from getting them implanted. I still think you should get them implanted if that's what you want to do, and I don't really think it's going to have a massive effect on their growth. Is it best to wait until 9 to 12 months of age to get hobs implanted? Let me do some maths. Okay, so my hobs were born, Oscar was born in May. January, February, March, April, May. May's the 5th month. So would I get him done in May of next year? Is that the question? Okay, so let's use Oscar as an example, right? Oscar was born the 3rd of May, so if I was to wait a year to have him implanted, it would be May again. And ferrets typically come into season in March, so he would then have already started coming into hob rut and all that stuff, and that could cause problems. So if you want to avoid that, you want to get them implanted at around 7 to 8 months old instead, to prevent them from coming into season at all, because hob rut can tear groups of ferrets apart, let me tell you. Is the risk of adrenal the same as neutering, since the implant is often used to manage symptoms of adrenal? No. Using the implant has not been linked to adrenal, and that is why it's so thoroughly recommended by vets. That's why it's become so popular and so common, is because there is no link there to adrenal, which is one of the leading diseases in the US and US and North America the same thing? Okay, what was the same? Okay, so the implant isn't linked to adrenal, that's why it's so common, that's why it's so popular, that's why people like it. Adrenal is the leading disease in North America in ferrets, and so it's really a problem, right? And the implant in theory helps prevent adrenal, but also hasn't been known to cause adrenal. Currently the theory that we're working with adrenal is that it's genetic, is triggered by photoperiods, and is triggered by being desexed too young. So those are the 3 reasons we're theorising could cause adrenal. Do we truly know? No, unfortunately not. But that's the theory that we're working with right now. So if you're worried about adrenal, you don't want to get your ferrets desexed, have them implanted instead, because then you don't have to worry about adrenal. And this person also said thanks and I loved your channel. I love you! You just made my day. I'm gonna wipe a tear away. I'm just kidding, I'm not actually crying. Yes, I am. I'm not. We actually talked about this in the Discord server yesterday. I mentioned that I was going to be making this video, and we all got to talking about implants and people were asking questions, so I'm going to scroll up quickly to that conversation that occurred yesterday to see if I can find anything else that was talked about that I want to add in. Scroll, 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 scroll. By the way, first of all, you probably watch Bryn if you're watching me, right? Because, I mean, she's the queen of ferrets on YouTube right now. Absolute queen, bow down to our queen. So if you watch Bryn, if you watch me, you probably already watch Bryn, and if you watch me, you're probably already in the Patsu and Friends Discord server. But if you're not, you should go and check out Bryn's channel, and you should think about joining the server because it's absolutely brilliant. I love that server, it's so great. Do you know what, I actually can't find the conversation that happened yesterday because we talked so much in here that everything just gets lost. But I think I covered everything, I think I got everything. But if you have any questions, message me on the Discord server, leave it in a comment down below or something. I'll get to it, I'll answer it, I'll do my best. That's it. I hope you enjoyed this video, I hope you learned something. I hope this helped you decide whether or not to get your ferret implanted, or maybe now you have more information so you can go to your vet and talk about it. Because that's all I hope for, really, is just to help people, because this is such a complicated issue and there's so much information. There's gel jabs and implants and vasectomy hobs and there's spaying and neutering, and it's just so confusing. So hopefully this has helped you in some way. Please like, comment and subscribe, it really helps my channel. I don't care about views, I don't care about all that, but obviously videos like this I want to reach a wider audience because it's really important information. This information is really hard to find online, and so if you like and comment on this video, that will like push the video out with the YouTube algorithm, however it works, so that more people can see it, because the aim really is to help ferrets. As always, I appreciate you all so much. You've all been such a fantastic support, really encouraging me to keep this going, and I've really been enjoying it, so thank you all so much for supporting me. I love you all. Bye! In the UK, in Britain, UK and Britain are the same thing.
Is Mexico not technically though in North America?
Mexico is South America.
Is it not that we like ridge bit?
Mexico is not in North America, it's in South America!
I thought it was that wee ridge that like separated it.
No.
So the bit where the land goes really thin?
I don't know what that is.
I think that's Cuba, somewhere around there.
Cuba's South America as well! Oh my god,
but
Canada's up north! So you've got Canada, you've got the United States, North America.
I know, right, Canada, United States, Mexico. But I thought that Mexico was technically in South America.
It's South, you just said it was not. Do you know what, let's just leave this discussion.
I don't like these bug bites.
Alternatively,